Welcome to the Philly Prime Podcast. I'm Dave Schratweiser. This week, Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro, a rising star in the Democratic Party. He has a new budget coming out. He's got the fix on I-95 that went so well, and everybody's starting to talk about him because, as he likes to say, I get more stuff done. Joining us today, Bruce Gordon, my former colleague at FOX29, currently the FOX29 Political analyst, who here to weigh in on Josh Shapiro. Bruce, welcome back from your vacation, my friend.
Thank you very much. I'm tan, rested, and ready, as a politician once said.
Yeah, there you go.
So yeah, I kept track. I was actually in the Galapagos Islands, 600 miles off the coast of Ecuador, but the Wi-Fi was good, so I was keeping track of things even as we were looking at sea turtles and iguanas and so forth. So,
and folks, just so you know, I dragged him off a 194-foot yacht to come here and do Philly Prime Podcast. Not really dragged him. His vacation was up and he's back.
It was up, right? You got to go back to real life sooner or later.
Yeah. There you go, Bruce. Just generally, Governor Shapiro's had a couple of nice W's so far in his first year and a couple of months here. He's got a new state budget out. He fixed I-95, as I mentioned before. His name's popping up all over the place. He has money to spend on schools. He's not raising taxes. Where would you rank him? 1 to 5? He's pretty close to a 5 so far, I think.
Yeah, I mean, there have been really no massive missteps. There was the issue, of course, with Mike Vera, one of the members in his administration, who had some sexual misconduct allegations against him, and there was some real question about whether that was handled properly or as effectively or as promptly as it should have been by the Shapiro administration. But that is about it, as far as I can see, in terms of the big missteps. Otherwise, it has been pretty smooth sailing. Look, this is a guy who is a moderate Democrat, which is going to play well in more places than a liberal Democrat would play in Pennsylvania. He is bright. He is sharp. He's good on the microphone and in front of the camera. And this is a guy who clearly is on everybody's radar for higher office. And don't think for a minute that his own radar isn't looking at that higher office. He's 50 years old, part of that new generation that everybody talks about wanting, while we have two 300-year-old candidates for president gearing up this time around.
Hey, I'm an old guy too, so careful with that.
I'm not much younger than you are, barely. But look, he is part of that new generation, and it certainly doesn't hurt that he's part of a swing state, that he's one of the main guys, in fact, obviously the main guy in one of the no more than 6, 7, maybe 8 states in the entire country that really matter come presidential election time. So we'll talk about all of that.
Look, he's an affable guy. I've done many an interview with him. I know you have as well, when he was Attorney General and some of his other roles, and very easy guy to like. Clearly a people person. His motto, get more stuff done. He's got a couple changes to that. I won't use them on this show. But he does seem to have caught people's eye. And I think let's talk a little bit for 2 seconds about the I-95 thing, just the speed at which he realized, hey, this is a major problem, and this could be one of those detriments that you talked about if I don't jump on this right away. And man, did he jump on it. Incredible.
Yeah. And this is something, we can talk all we want about the big picture issues of the day, whether it's immigration or it's abortion or any of these other big sort of issues that for many people are esoteric. Lots of folks aren't going to be directly impacted by the immigration crisis. Lots of people will never have to make the decision regarding an abortion scenario. But the day-to-day, everyday stuff that happens in life that the politician, the elected official, can do a great job fixing or a terrible job fixing, that's what sticks with people. I went to school outside of the city of Chicago back in the late 70s and early 80s. And the situation there was the incumbent mayor did a terrible job on one particular massive snowstorm. And the challenger the next time around reminded every voter, this is what happened with the incumbent. He couldn't get your streets plowed and you were stuck in your house, or you couldn't get to work or to the store. Those are the real basic kinds of things. And you don't have to be a big political expert to figure out this is where people live. And when you can fix a highway that is so vital to the region as I-95 is, and look, as usual, he's not the guy out there with the shovel and operating the backhoe, but it's
Hmm.
the organization. It's getting the money to the right place. It's getting the right people in place. I recall, if I'm not mistaken, trying to dry some of the area that was really wet, and they were trying to get this thing dry. Didn't they bring in a
Yep.
massive blower from Dover
Sure.
Downs, from the racetrack, the NASCAR
Yeah.
track down in Delaware, to
Right.
dry things? So that kind of thinking outside the box, even though he's not the one actually operating the equipment, is massively important. And yeah,
Mm.
that thing got fixed in record time, and everybody looked around and said, "This guy gets
Yeah.
stuff done."
And listen, the fix itself was something a lot of people had never heard of. Basically, what they did was
Yeah,
backfill underneath the highway where the truck had caught fire and brought the collapse of the highway down. Unfortunately, the driver of that truck lost his life.
yeah,
Um, but he filled in underneath, and they put in the temporary roadway, some of that, and then they continued to work on completing the full repair. And
yeah,
it was days, not weeks or months, that people kind of prognosticated about when this first happened. And I got to tell
yeah,
you, he blew people's doors off with the repair of I-95. And you say, oh, that's just a Philly issue. No, it's not. I-95 in that spot is traveled by thousands of trucks a day that transport
yeah,
everything you use at your home up north, down south, or whatever, from either New York south or the
yeah.
northeast south, or from the south up north.
Oh,
So
it's a
it does have
huge
a
artery.
region,
Yeah,
and it got national attention. The
yeah,
fix that he used, and the speed at which he did it, and it was days.
yeah. And look, we all have, and one of the things that's so wonderful about that story, as sort of a symbolic of what a politician can do right. I live in Delaware County, and without getting into too many of the details, there's not far from me a little 2-lane road, relatively heavily traveled 2-lane road that I use to get around in various places, as do thousands of other people. And that was washed out in a storm. That little overpass over a little creek was washed out, and it has been months
Mm,
and months and months. And that road is still closed at that area. And that's what people are used to, right?
yeah,
The
yeah.
My town, my city can't get anything fixed. A relatively small overpass like that, and it's shut down for like a year because
Yeah.
nobody can seem to figure out what to do about it. And this
Mhm.
happened in days. So no
Yeah.
question about it. It's
Yeah.
the kind of thing people remember, and for all the right reasons. And
Yeah.
that is one of those big victories on the checking the pluses and minuses for any incumbent.
Oh, and I could hear that in a presidential debate or some other kind of debate down the road here. I could hear him saying, "Well, let me talk about something that I did back in 2023 that
Yeah.
was a remarkable feat." And he's right about that. And I don't think there's any downside to it that I've seen.
No,
So props to
no.
him on that.
And in fact got
Yeah,
some
sure.
compliments from Republicans, which in this
Yes,
day and age, for anyone from the opposite party to acknowledge that you did a good job is certainly, a rare occasion indeed. I have to say, however,
and people
with
wanted to
all
get
of
on the
this,
success bus here with him in fixing that. So that would be
of course,
politically stupid to not join him to get this done.
yeah, in politics, the old saying goes, which is that success has many fathers and failures an
There you go.
orphan.
Yeah.
And that was certainly the case there. But look, what's interesting to me, among other things, and Josh Shapiro is a fascinating character, he has had some pretty good, I don't want, luck may be too
Mhm.
patronizing a word to use, but he has been fortunate to be, in some cases, sort of in the right place at the right
Right.
time. He won his
Mhm.
seat on the Montgomery County Commissioners at a time when a county that had been very Republican, back in the day, Montgomery County was one of those counties that Republicans counted on to dull or mute the effect of losing big in Philadelphia. And of course, over from around 2000 on, those counties, Montgomery County, Delaware County, Bucks and Chester, Bucks perhaps not quite as much as the others, but all of them have shifted blue. And
Mhm.
he was part of that wave. Now, you can argue, was
Mhm.
that wave in part because he was such a strong candidate, or was he getting votes in part because that county was trending blue, Montgomery County meaning? So he gets into that position. He winds up running for successfully attorney general, and then from attorney general to the governor's race. And of course, as we all remember, in that
Mhm.
governor's race in 2022, he faced Doug Mastriano.
Mhm.
And let's be real honest here. Doug Mastriano was a terrible candidate
Mhm.
for a statewide office in a state where it's a very purple state, of course, Pennsylvania. A
Yeah.
Republican candidate, all things being equal, should be able to compete very well and,
You would
in
think.
fact, win a statewide race. And
Mm.
certainly many Republicans do. Mastriano lost to Shapiro by 15 percentage points. It was never a contest.
Yeah.
Mastriano was clearly seen as far too extreme.
Mm-hmm.
And that part of that is good fortune for Josh Shapiro, who ran, of course, unopposed in the Democratic primary. So when you figure unopposed in your primary and in your general election, you wind up with a candidate who was simply too extreme for most voters. It was a pretty smooth glide path to the governor's office for Josh Shapiro.
All right, think about the right place, right time. Good transition into the budget, the state budget. Josh inherited a $14 billion cash reserve in the budget, and he just came out with his budget, $48.3 billion budget. He gives more money to education, which has been deemed underfunded by the courts. So he's addressing that with $1.1 billion, a 14% increase to the 500 school districts in the area. Philadelphia is going to get a big chunk of that. I think the poor districts get $872 million. If I'm reading my numbers right, Philly gets a big chunk of that. There's no tax increase in this budget, and it sounds like there might not be one for the next 5 years.
Well, remember, there's that big $14 billion reserves, and as my understanding of the numbers is that about $3 billion of that they would carve out for this budget, this $48 billion budget.
Correct.
So some of that rainy day fund, if you will, is going to be dug into in order to fund the various proposals. But yeah, there's much more money for education, both K through 12 and the university system, both the state system and the state relateds. And it's a little bit complicated, but the state related universities are folks like
$200 million
Temple
for higher
University.
ed.
Temple University and Penn State, Lincoln University and University of Pittsburgh are all state related universities. So yeah, there's more money for all those folks.
And he's also benefiting, Bruce, while
time.
we're talking about that, he's also benefiting from $1 billion more in tax collections, according to his budget address. And he wants to legalize marijuana, which we'll talk about for a minute, and produce it here and sell it here, which he thinks will bring in about $250 million a year new revenue.
Ultimately, so, that's going to take a little while to ramp up if it happens.
It's raining money now.
Well, you know what's interesting? This is one of those issues that over time, public opinion changes. If you went back 25, 30, 35 years ago, there's no way people would be accepting of recreational marijuana. Now, the only state around Pennsylvania that does not already have recreational marijuana is West Virginia. West Virginia is about as conservative a state as there is in the entire country. Of course, ironically, West Virginia has a massive, massive problem with the opioid crisis. So they've got a drug situation. And look, maybe that colors their view of the issue. I don't claim to be an expert in West Virginia politics, but I do know that they have been particularly ravaged by the opioid crisis. So at any rate, the point is that most of the states around Pennsylvania have already accepted the idea of recreational marijuana. And it is one of those things where at some point you kind of sit down and say, it's happening. We might as well get the tax dollars out of it as opposed to pretending that it's not happening. And there's apparently even some Republican support for this idea. We'll see how that plays out. And of course, all of this with the budget is always a function of what kind of support do you have in the legislature, because the budget proposal is nothing but a piece of paper unless you can get it past the legislature. And of course, while Democrats have a very thin majority in the House, the Republicans have the majority in the Senate, and so nothing is guaranteed with these plans.
The other good news for Philadelphia, $140 million more for SEPTA, which is long overdue and much needed in many respects. And there's another SEPTA controversy woven into this budget time here, but let's talk about $150 million more for SEPTA. They need that money desperately.
They do. It's interesting. I've covered SEPTA long enough to remember the years where year after year after year there would be the budget crisis, and we would sit at news conferences where they would describe how much in the hole they were. And finally, they kind of got their financial act together and things were going well for a while. Then along comes the pandemic. And, I wish I had an answer. All I know is that, look, lots and lots and lots of people who used to commute via SEPTA, say on the regional rail, for example, from the suburbs surrounding Philadelphia into the city to go to their job in their office building 5 days a week. That's not happening anymore. And it's not going to happen anymore. Those days are over. At best, you have some of these folks going into the office 2-3 days a week and working from home the other days. That is a massive chunk out of the consumer base, the customer base for SEPTA. And so it becomes this sort of death spiral, frankly. You have fewer folks riding the rails, so you cut back on the schedule. You cut back on the schedule, and it becomes less convenient for folks to use that system. And they say,
Mm-hmm.
you know what, I'll figure out some other way to get there because this
Yeah.
just isn't convenient for me. They
Mm-hmm.
stop riding. Fewer riders means you cut the schedule more, and so on
Yeah.
and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And the next thing you know, you're circling the drain. The other issue I would say there, Dave, is that with SEPTA, it is a great example of trying to convince outstate legislators that this is something good for the entire state, that
Mm-hmm.
Philadelphia is the economic engine that drives the whole state, because it's rather easy for someone who's
Yeah.
100 miles away from Philadelphia to say, why do I care about the bus system in Philadelphia? And I already have a viewpoint that Philadelphia is the place where tax dollars go to die. And why do I care about this? So they've got a selling job to do with SEPTA, as they do with some of these other agencies, to
Mm-hmm.
explain to folks, here's why you should care about regional rail in Philadelphia and the bus system in Philadelphia and so forth.
Yeah. Also trying to sell as part of this a $15 an hour minimum wage. He wants to borrow some money to use for commercial site development to attract businesses, high-tech companies. He's definitely brushing up against the economic issues that drive the state, those kind of things. Those are always big pocket proposals, but you have to make them because you do have to continue to build the base of businesses that are in Pennsylvania to keep the $14 billion surplus cash reserve coming in and the new tax collections coming in.
Yeah, and look, that $15 an hour minimum wage, that has always been controversial over the last quite a number of years. And look, one of the reasons why it is such a sticker shock to say, wow, it's $7.25 now in Pennsylvania, which is the federal minimum wage. My God, you're doubling it and then some. Well, yeah, you're doubling it and then some, in part because the lawmakers have let it sit at the same level now for year after year after year after year. If you didn't get a pay raise for 5 or 10 or 15 straight years, when you finally got one, you would certainly expect more than a 2 or 3 or 4% pay raise. Similarly, when you haven't raised the minimum wage in your state in many, many years, that 7.25 an hour is frankly pathetic by any standard. But small businesses will tell you, look, I can't simply double that and say $15 an hour, even if they were paying over the 7.25,
Sure.
on their own right now. They're say they're paying $10 an hour for some of their starter employees. That's still a 50% increase to go to $15 an hour. And so there will be lots of pushback on that, as there always is.
In my 25 years at Fox 29, I don't think a year went by where that wasn't a topic when the budget came out, pushing the minimum wage higher and higher and higher. And you're right, that's a pathetic number at 725.
Well, again, it's the kind of thing where if you worked at it year by
Yeah.
year, you wouldn't
Yeah.
have the sticker shock that you do after 15 years of doing nothing. It's just, it's a variation of what happens with toll booth increases, on the bridge tolls. Nothing happens for a fair number of years at all, even though inflation is rising. And then after 5 or 10 years or so, now you raise it by a significant amount, and they always try to keep the amounts sort of even, by a quarter or 50 cents to make it easy for the transactions back when you actually handled money. But it always seemed like a massive increase. Well, part of the reason for that was that you didn't increase it year by year like everything else went up year by year. So part of that's sort of the mindset of it's a fascinating study for another day, but the whole the psychology of how this stuff works and how people think about price increases and so forth.
Back on Shapiro for a minute, another checked box by him is tough on crime. He has the law enforcement background as being the attorney general in the state, and he was a very good attorney general. Got a lot of things done. He had a gun strike force here in Philadelphia. He took on some cases that he didn't like that were handled by Larry Krasner as the DA in Philadelphia. In this budget, $31 million more for state police for equipment. They took some hits when that high-profile escape happened from the prison, that they didn't have the right number of personnel and potentially the equipment they needed, aircraft, things like that. So there's $31 million for the state police. There's $1.5 million to add personnel to monitor gun retailers to see make sure that they're not selling weapons or selling them appropriately.
Straw purchasers and so forth.
Things like that. They crack down on that. There's $23 million for anti-violence programs at the schools, after-school programs, recreation, cleaning up parks and public facilities so kids can use them, that kind of stuff. He's touching on all those issues, and he is viewed as tough on crime. And
there's no question
that would be another box I would check for the guy in a national race.
In a purple state, he is not viewed as somebody who is too far to the left.
Hmm.
And that's important. I mean, it's one thing to say, this guy did well in a statewide election. You say, well, all right, let's take a look at that. I mean, I remember vividly Ed Rendell was probably to the left of Josh Shapiro on the political
Hmm.
spectrum. And when
Yeah.
Rendell was winning his races, he was winning with massive margins in Philadelphia and the
Yeah.
counties immediately surrounding Philadelphia. But
Hmm.
the total number of counties that he won in the state of Pennsylvania were very few.
Yeah.
In the case of Ed Rendell,
Right.
Shapiro won more than a dozen counties in Pennsylvania. It doesn't sound like much when you've got 66,
Yep.
67 counties in the state, but
Hmm.
many of those counties, of course, are smaller rural counties with low population, very much right of political center. You're never going to win those as a Democrat, but he definitely did a better job than say an Ed Rendell in terms of winning in some of these areas where there is a chance for a Democrat to win. He's
Hmm.
not going to be able to be painted with that brush of being a far left, loony liberal kind of thing. That's simply not going to fly when
Yeah.
you're facing a Josh Shapiro. It's just not
Yeah.
going to work.
Yeah. Okay. Controversial thing came up right before the budget, November, early December, and has kind of bled into January and February here. And that's the legislation that would appoint a special prosecutor to handle crimes on SEPTA or within, I believe, 500 feet of SEPTA properties and
Mhm.
things like that, passed by the legislature, signed by Shapiro. They missed the deadline to appoint a special prosecutor. I think the first deadline, they're trying to reconfigure that and appoint that. But that set
Mhm.
off a firestorm with Philadelphia DA Larry Krasner, who doesn't like the proposal, claims it's pulling jurisdiction away from him. Um, Josh was on Channel 10, NBC 10, um, talking about this and the heat that he's getting about this, those kind of things.
Mhm.
Um, I actually think it's a good idea. The more attention and resources I think you can throw at the crime problem in Philadelphia and on the SEPTA lines around Philadelphia and in the suburbs, I think that's a good thing. I think Larry Krasner, and probably rightfully so from his position, views this as a grab, and you're
Sure.
trying to take something away from me, and in fact has thrown that out there that 150,000 people voted for me. You're in essence nullifying part of their vote by taking these powers away from me. Shapiro's argument is that this is a concurrent jurisdiction situation, and the more
Right.
help, the merrier. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I think there's two things. There's the reality of it, the sort of on the ground reality of it, and that is that the state with their resources, maybe they could do a better job of
Hmm.
prosecuting some of these cases involving SEPTA or sort of tangentially related to SEPTA. The
Hmm.
political equation, I think, is just as interesting, and that pretty clearly is that's the legislature saying to Larry Krasner, "We don't like you. We didn't
Hmm.
like you before. We don't like you
Right.
now. We're not going to like you tomorrow. And
Mm.
any chance we have to stick it to you, we're going to do it. And
Yeah.
so we're going to take this away from you." And Krasner, of course, is perhaps understandably annoyed by that.
Hmm.
And look, whether you like Krasner or not, this was as much the mindset about why the legislature did this, I have to believe, is two-thirds politics to one-third law enforcement.
Right.
But be that as it may, interestingly, from Shapiro's standpoint, now
Hmm.
you've got a governor who says, I'm not just going to automatically stand beside the DA in the city that represents sort of my home base of
Hmm.
support, the Philadelphia area. I'm going to side with the legislature on this.
Yeah.
And it's a relatively low cost. I mean, he'll get some grief from some circles, but it's a
Yeah, but it's a
relatively low
pick your
cost
battles thing.
move.
He's picking a good battle, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's the battle to pick. He's not going to get a whole lot of grief over it, but he's
Hmm.
likely to get some attaboys from folks out in the other areas of the state who say, "Hey, you're not just in lockstep with that liberal prosecutor Larry Krasner in
Hmm.
Philadelphia. We kind
Yep.
of like that." It's
Yeah.
not going to change the mind of someone who's hard right, but it
Yeah.
could easily soften the view of someone who's somewhere in the middle to say, I like the fact that this guy didn't just automatically stand up for the fellow Democrat
Yeah.
in his home turf in the Philadelphia area.
Oh yeah, and he's bumped heads with him when he was attorney general a couple of times on cases that got referred up to the attorney general's office, or that
Right.
people thought the attorney general's office should handle because they didn't like the way Krasner was handling certain things. But listen, I'll
Right.
give props to Krasner here. He's fighting for his turf, um, and that's what he
Sure.
wants to do. He's also, mending fences as we go in his second term here a little bit. It'd be interesting to
Yeah.
see if there's some kind of compromise reached here, or can we work together kind of thing. But I think Act 40, which is what this is, precludes that. I don't think they're allowed to work together on a case. If it goes to the special prosecutor,
one or the other.
It's the special prosecutor, not Larry
Yeah.
Krasner. So it'd be interesting to see.
Yeah, I was going to say, interestingly, I just saw this mentioned yesterday, so I looked the numbers up just to verify them. The murder numbers, speaking of Larry Krasner, I'll get on my brief Larry Krasner soapbox for about 30 seconds here.
Yeah.
The murder numbers this year compared to last year to date, so we're talking about less than 2 months out of a 12-month year. Murder numbers this year down 34% or so from last year, and last year down about 20% from the year before.
Right.
Which goes back to my point that I've been making in a drumbeat I've had now for a couple of years, which is that for reasons that sociologists and criminologists may figure out someday, the pandemic and the societal upheaval around that had a massive impact on this violent crime that occurred. Because I'm unaware, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I'm unaware of any massive police staffing or philosophical or tactical change in the last year and a half that has these numbers now going back down to where they were before the pandemic. So, if you're going to say that Larry Krasner was the cause of all these murder numbers going sky high in Philadelphia, well, then I suppose by that logic, he should get the credit for them coming down. I don't think he had much to do with either one, going up or going down.
Yeah, and if you talk to the criminologists, as you're talking about here, I mean, these things ebb and flow. They go up, they come down. This is a down period right now. We have a new mayor and a new police commissioner who are going to be the beneficiaries of that, along with the governor. The numbers are down. Not saying that any of them did anything specifically at this point yet, a month and a half into it, that would impact that. But I will say this. The numbers went up in Philadelphia for a number of reasons, all of which we've talked ad infinitum about. But having said that, there was not a lot of pushback from the Philadelphia Police Department. I'm sorry to say that. I love the men and women of the Philadelphia Police Department. I'm not putting it on them. There were not enough initiatives to attack some of these problems. The carjacking thing got way out of hand before we had a carjacking task force. The stolen car epidemic last year, like a ridiculous number of stolen cars, out of control, but we didn't do anything solid about it. I'm not saying we didn't do anything, but we didn't throw the spotlight on it fast enough. The same thing with the gun violence and the murders. Same thing.
And really briefly, Dave, we're out of the stolen car situation. This is kind of a fascinating scenario. Technology has changed the notion of stolen cars now, right?
Certainly.
Back in the old days, you parked your car, you walked away from it, and 10 minutes later, somebody came by and hot-wired your vehicle or figured out a way to get into the ignition, and you could do that with older model cars. Now, of course, with these key fobs and so forth, the driver sort of has to be there. So now you've got a scenario where you're getting not just a stolen car. Now the category is more of a carjacking, where
the proliferation
you
of
pull
carjacking.
into the parking lot, right? You pull into the parking lot, you turn off the ignition. Suddenly there's a gun to your head, and they're stealing your car because they've got your key fob and so forth. So it's not just that the stolen car numbers were sky high. Every one of these incidents was even more violent or potentially deadly than the old way of stealing cars. So you're right. I think, weeks and months later to say, well, we've got a new initiative about this. You're right. I think there needed to be, and always needs to be, a much faster response when these things happen.
And I think you're going to see that. I think Kevin Bethel, the new police commissioner, has been over at City Hall in the last couple of weeks talking about some staffing maneuvers, things to do to improve that, to get more people in the academy, to bump the numbers back up, because I believe it's 3,800 is the number of actual armed police officers on the street each day. That's not a good number. That has to come up. They've promised to bring it up. I'm sure they're going to go to Josh Shapiro at some point and say, we could use a little help with this. You know what I mean? That kind of thing. And maybe there's a program bolstered by the state to do that. Again, you got to win that battle with the legislature about approving more money for Philadelphia. But when you see the numbers, anybody who wouldn't want to be involved in improving the violence problem in Philadelphia, again, is politically stupid. I mean, everybody wins.
It's right at the top of the list for everybody's concern.
You're in the suburbs. You come in to go to restaurants in Philadelphia. You want to be safe. You work in Philadelphia. You want to commute in on SEPTA. I want less crime on SEPTA, less crime on my work from the subway station or the train station to my office. That's what I want. So it does impact people.
The police situation in particular, I think, is particularly interesting because I spent 25 plus years working in the city of Philadelphia every day. I live in the suburbs outside of Philadelphia. I literally just last night went into the city to go out with my wife and daughter to a restaurant. And once again, this was a center city area. But once again, I could walk blocks and blocks and blocks and never lay eyes
See a cop.
on a
Yep.
Philadelphia police officer.
Yeah.
Not necessarily even a police squad car going by, but certainly not the proverbial boots on the ground, cops walking a beat, giving that sense of, hey, if anything were to happen, we're right here. So we've got your back as the police department and so forth. And you're right; those numbers have to come up. Easier said than done.
Yeah.
It is a tough job and not the most desirable job in the world for some folks. You have to have the right mindset, that public service mindset. But those numbers have to come up because that changes the attitude when you see that that kind of situation. You there's a sense of, hey, I feel a little more comfortable now because I know that if something bad were to happen, the police are right here.
And I got to say this, looking at the numbers nationwide, they're down. Murders are down. Carjackings are down. Gun crimes are down. I'm not saying anything is specifically responsible for that, but that wave right now has kind of ebbed and is going down. So having said that, this is a good time now to put in place programs that could drive it down even more. So the next time you get a tsunami of crime going up, it's less than it would be if you just let this go unabated. Because if you let this time period go by and ride the wave just because it's going down and do nothing further to bolster the situation, you failed as a politician.
Absolutely.
You failed.
It's a great point. It's a great point.
You know, when you have money, put some money in the bank so you can spend it later. Rainy day fund, as they like to call it. Yeah.
Right. Because the reality is, again, these numbers went down from last year compared to the year before. They went down in 23 compared to 22. So, for example, in the Parker administration, the Sherrell Parker administration, if they do nothing and just ride that wave, as you say, as those numbers start to go down and then want to take credit for it afterwards, there are going to be folks out there, folks like me, saying, wait a minute, these numbers were heading down anyway. What did you specifically do to help drive them down even further? And unless you've got a good answer for that question, I'm sorry, I can't give you much credit for the fact that these numbers went down.
Yeah, and I can't
thrilled
give
that they went down, but I'm not giving you credit for it because you
or
didn't
my
do much
vote,
about it.
or my vote, because you didn't do anything. So let's do this. Let's go back to Shapiro for a minute. Great piece in Philly Mag last week. I think it was last week from Victor Fiorello. Wrote kind of a Q&A with Josh. Pretty candid, pretty straightforward. He let the guard down a little bit, I think, and spoke his mind on a few things. Popping up on the landscape left and right with all the controversy about President Biden and his age and his mental capacity and things like that. Names start to pop up as possible replacements.
Sure.
Josh's name kind of popped up at the back end of the top 5 on a couple of shows that I watched. People kind of didn't want to get away from the conversation without mentioning, hey, and then you got Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania, big state that any presidential candidate has to get as a, draft them at the convention thing. I don't see that this time around, but if I'm him, I'm him, and you want me to, attach my car to that train locomotive, I'll attach it for a little bit and let you drive me, right? Politically, bring a little more spotlight on you, improve your name recognition outside Pennsylvania.
It's the oldest, it's the oldest game in the book to say, well, I'm not really pushing this narrative, but I'm flattered that people want me to. We've seen people to the point where, in local politics and statewide politics, you know perfectly well that their folks are the ones sort of ginning up this supposed draft Bruce Gordon for governor kind of movement. And I say, well, I'm flattered that everyone thinks I'm such a wonderful guy, but it's really not on my radar at the moment. Well, sure it is. Look, 4 years from now,
disingenuous.
Josh Shapiro will be, it's completely disingenuous. 4 years from now, Josh Shapiro will be 54 years old, which I think a lot of folks would tell you that all other things being equal is kind of the wheelhouse for what you might want in someone who has to have the temperament, the experience, and the sort of energy level to do a job that is arguably the most difficult job in the entire world. Look, Shapiro certainly has the resume, state rep, county commissioner of a million or so person county, statewide attorney general in a big, diverse state, and then governor of that state. So we certainly got the resume. What I would caution folks is, again, we've said
Yep.
to a certain extent, he's led a little bit of a charmed life so
This
far.
was my next question, but you go
And
right there because I knew you were going to go there. Go
yeah,
ahead.
well, look, everybody thought Ron DeSantis was the next big thing in the
There you
Republican
go.
Party because
Mm,
he had won this big reelection victory over a frankly fairly weak Democrat in Florida,
mm.
a
Yep.
state that is trending more and more red. But everyone thought Ron DeSantis was the next big thing. You know, he was the it guy.
Yep.
And turned out he wasn't the it guy. He was
Mm,
closer to something that rhymes with it. As a candidate, he was a terrible candidate. And, you know, he is sort of acknowledged to a certain degree
mm,
that he ran a poor campaign. His media strategy was awful.
mm.
Didn't know how to thread the needle between criticizing Donald Trump and trying to get his own voters and so forth without
Mhm.
angering the base. So my point is simply that we have seen Josh Shapiro in some pretty strong, pretty healthy scenarios for him. When the going gets tough, that's when you figure out whether someone is really the politician that you think they are. And we
Mm.
simply don't know. I don't claim to know that Josh Shapiro is or isn't that guy. I know
Yep.
that so far he's had a fairly smooth sail of things,
Right.
but we'll see. Look, he has got the skills that you would want. He's a good communicator, as we said.
Good
He's
looking
got the
guy.
energy.
Yep.
He's got the whole telegenic,
Yep.
good talker, looks good on TV. Again, a moderate Democrat who
Hmm.
could actually, get the moderate vote out there, which is where these elections are won these days. The
Yep.
far left is never going to vote for a Republican. The far right's never going to vote for a Democrat. But you've got
Right.
perhaps 10, 15% in the middle who could actually make a difference in these kinds of races. And so
Hmm.
I think there's certainly something there. I don't see. I mean, look, who knows what happens health wise? I mean, just purely from an actuarial standpoint,
Yep.
at Joe Biden's age, who knows what could happen in the next 8 months or 9 months or so
Hmm.
between
Yep.
now and election day.
Right.
Um, but I don't see, assuming he is physically well, I don't see anything happening at the convention where someone suddenly stands up and says, "We're
Mm.
throwing you out and we're putting the new guy in." There is
Yeah.
a lot of anger, I think, among many Democrats that
Yeah.
Biden, who, if he didn't promise it, certainly implied that he would be a one-term president. He's
Yeah.
the link between the Trump years and the new era of
Hmm.
politics. But it is awfully tough to say goodbye to the
Hmm.
most demanding but also most powerful job in the world.
Hmm.
And there's no indication, at least to date, that Joe Biden has any intention of
Hmm.
stepping aside. So I don't see Shapiro
Yeah.
in the particular short term, nor,
Yeah.
despite all the buzz you hear, do
Yeah.
I see him swapping out Kamala Harris as VP,
No.
for example, for a
No.
Josh Shapiro. I don't see
No.
any chance of that happening either.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's political suicide, among other things.
Yeah. If you're Josh Shapiro, if the political talk shows on Sunday mornings start to give you invitations to chat you up a little bit and talk to you, get to know you, kind of, who is Josh Shapiro and why is his name being mentioned in the top 5 people who could replace a Joe Biden or maybe the next time in 2028 be a front running kind of candidate? You take that opportunity, don't you? Do you not?
You build a studio in your home, you keep
There
the
you go.
lights on at all times and
Like
the
this.
camera hot, and you
Yeah.
sit in the chair in front of that camera, and
Yeah.
whenever someone says they want you on, you flip the
Yeah.
switch and you're
Yeah.
on.
You talk
Yeah, you
I-95, you talk I'm tough on crime, you talk on my budget, you talk I got a surplus, you
exactly
got it.
right.
I gave
Yeah.
more money for education, I gave more money for cops. You do all that stuff and you
What
come
is
out of that
interesting, however,
looking
having
good.
said all of that, yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's all true. But what's interesting about it as well is think about,
Mhm.
say, somebody like a Chris Christie.
Sure.
The timing with some of this stuff is massively important, right?
Right.
Those who, for example, took Joe Biden seriously when he didn't
Mhm.
promise, but implied that he would be a one-term president,
Yeah.
might have looked at this time around and said, maybe this is my opportunity. So for
Mhm.
someone like Josh Shapiro, he's going to have to wait 4 years.
Yeah.
There was discussion, Biden, his own,
Mhm.
when he ran versus not running and so forth. When there was a situation with Chris Christie, he had that window of opportunity where he was this massively popular governor in
Yeah.
New Jersey. Here is a guy in a deep blue state. He's a Republican governor, but he seems to be popular. He seems to be able to work with both sides. He's a common
Mhm.
sense guy. He's not the most telegenic guy in the world, but he certainly knows how to work a room,
Yeah.
certainly knows how to talk rings around most folks. And
Correct.
he had his opportunity. That window was there for a brief moment. By
Mhm.
the time he actually came around, say this time,
Mhm.
the message was yesterday's news, and he
Yeah.
was a terrible messenger for it. All of his
Yeah.
criticisms of Donald Trump fell
Mhm.
flat because he was
Yeah.
the wrong messenger, and so he's
Yeah.
just another guy. After
Yeah.
all that brief window where he was the rising star and a relatively
Yep.
young guy at that,
Yeah.
that window slammed shut, and he's just another guy now.
Yeah, the window closed, the door closed, and the train left the station. I mean, it was over in a hurry, and clearly, I mean,
the car crossed the bridge, so to speak.
There you go.
Not the George Washington Bridge, mind you.
No, not that bridge. Let's not bring that controversy up again. Anyway, I think Shapiro has made some good inroads in his first year. I've always liked the guy. He's always been very approachable, always been very accessible. I mean, I literally could call his office and say, I'm doing a story tonight on X or Y, law enforcement wise, when he was attorney general, and they'd hook it up and they'd make it happen. I don't know if he's that accessible now, but he clearly is a guy that the media likes and who likes the media.
And knows how that media game is played. I mentioned DeSantis a few minutes ago. Ron DeSantis acknowledged sort of after the fact that he made a mistake when he shut out the more mainstream media outlets in the state of Florida, which you can do. As governor, you have a lot more strength and a lot more power to be able to say, I'm not talking to you, you, or you, but I will talk to you, you, and you. And he acknowledged after the fact that he probably made a mistake in shutting out the more mainstream sites, which he viewed as far too liberal, spoke only to some of the more right-leaning and right-wing sites, and thus didn't get his message out to a broader audience. You have to be able to, even if you have to hold your nose while you're doing it, you have to be able to work with the media and understand how the media game is played, so to speak, not to sound too cynical about it, but you have to understand how that game is played. And if you don't, you're in trouble. Josh Shapiro, I think, there's every reason to believe he fully understands how that game is played. And when bad things happen, then you get the benefit of the doubt from the media. And I hate to say that because that should never be a factor that, I like this person, so I give him the benefit of the doubt. But the question is, look, think about it in your own life, Dave. If you're dealing with a situation and two people are in the similar situation in terms of some kind of controversy or scandal of their own making, one of them has always been a jerk to you and never gave you the time of day. The other one bent over backwards to be cooperative and professional in your relations with them. Which guy are you at least subconsciously going to give the benefit of the doubt to? That's human nature. I mean,
okay. Listen, nice plug for Northwestern there with the hat today. I just thought I'd
do what I can.
And listen, I'm not your travel agent, but I'm sure there's another trip planned soon. Does it involve another 190-foot yacht here, or no? It does not.
No, I think we're actually going out to
I'm
Arizona.
poking. He's my buddy. I can give him a hard time.
We're figuring out some other trips, but it was a lot of fun, and it's funny, I can't call them vacations. When you're mostly retired, you really can't call it a vacation. You're on vacation from what?
Well, I was going to say, so I mean, we're on vacation every day, as my wife likes to tell me. So listen, I appreciate you coming on. I mean, I really do enjoy these conversations. It's good to get a kind of a look at a guy who people are talking about. The buzz has started and is gaining a little bit of momentum. So why not?
And I don't see it going away anytime soon.
Oh, I don't either. And I think it gets louder, right?
Barring some catastrophic mistake on his part that's going on behind the scenes that we don't know about. And I'm not suggesting there is something there, but those things can happen and derail a candidate who you thought was riding high. But barring something like that, he's got all the skills, checks all the boxes to be a major national player in the years ahead. So we'll
props to Josh Shapiro. He's like you said, he's a young guy. He's got the whole road in front of him, so to speak, politically. And
I-95, right?
Yeah, there you go. Repaired and working well. By the way, I've driven over that many times now since it was repaired, and I greatly appreciate what he did here. That can be a real nightmare if that was all screwed up. So.
Again, you're a guy who, in a national sense, obviously not necessarily in a Pennsylvania sense right now, but in a national sense, you're a voter and you remember those things, the basic day-to-day stuff that makes my life a little easier as a constituent. So
top of mind type thing. Yeah, Bruce, thanks again for coming on. I appreciate it. We'll do it again soon. Always a lot of fun to talk politics, and I appreciate that. And enjoy the next vacation, my friend. That's it for Philly Crime this week. Thanks everybody for listening, and thanks for joining my friend Bruce Gordon and I. We like to reminisce like we used to do in the newsroom at Fox 29. It's always a great and funny time. Thanks for coming on. I appreciate that. We'll see you next time.